The night was restless, filled with the rumble of thunder that rolled through the mountains like an ancient drumbeat. Rain splattered against the wooden shutters of the cabin, and the tall pines bent and swayed under the assault of the wind. Inside, Margaret sat by the fire in her rocker, the flames painting her face in shifting orange light. She had grown used to the silence of her life, though it was the kind of silence that gnawed slowly at the heart. Years had slipped away since her husband's passing, and though the cabin still stood strong, it often felt like a shell of what once had been. Her evenings were always the same. She would sit in the chair her husband had built with his own hands, knitting or staring into the fire, and sometimes she let her eyes linger on the other rocker across from her, forever empty. That emptiness seemed to stretch through every part of her life, through the hollow nights, through the mornings when no voice greeted her, through the long days when only the forest answered her with birdsong and wind. It was on such a night, when the storm pressed heavy against the world, that she heard it, scratching at the door. At first, she thought it was a loose branch blown against the wood, but then came a sound softer, sharper, a whimper. She froze, her heart quickening. No one came to her cabin this late, not in weather like this. She lit her lantern, its glow trembling in her hand, and walked slowly to the door. The scratching came again, urgent this time. She lifted the latch, and the storm's breath rushed in, cold and sharp. Lantern light fell on a small shape huddled against the porch. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a wolf pup, soaked, shivering, its fur plastered down, golden eyes wide with fear and need. In its mouth was something strange and terribly human, a baby blanket, faded and frayed, clutched tight between tiny teeth as though it were a treasure that kept it alive. Margaret stood motionless. The storm raged around them, yet all she could see was this fragile creature, trembling, eyes pleading silently for mercy. Wolves were not strangers to her. She had heard them howling in the distance on cold nights, had seen their shadows move at the tree line. But never had she been faced with one so small, so helpless, and never with such a mystery as the blanket it carried. She could have turned it away. Instinct whispered it was wild, that wolves did not belong in homes. Yet the sight of that blanket stirred something deeper, something that reached back to the memories she rarely allowed herself to touch. Memories of cradling a child, of loss so profound it left her soul aching. The pup whimpered again, and that was enough. She bent down, speaking in a soft voice she had not used in years, and lifted the little creature into her arms. It trembled against her chest, but it did not fight. She closed the door against the storm, shutting them both inside the fragile warmth of the cabin. By the fire, she dried the pup with an old towel, watching its tiny body shake with exhaustion. She warmed a bowl of milk, coaxing it to drink, her hands gentle and steady. The pup drank eagerly, then curled into a small bundle on the rug, still clutching the blanket. Margaret watched long into the night as the flames dimmed, her heart full of questions and wonder. In the days that followed, the pup grew stronger. She fed it bits of meat, washed the dirt from its fur, and tended to the cuts on its paws. Slowly, the fear in its eyes faded, replaced with trust. She named it Ash, for the gray of its coat and perhaps for the ashes from which it seemed to have risen. With Ash in the cabin, silence no longer pressed so heavily against her. The nights were filled with the soft sound of paws across the floor, the mornings with playful yips as he tugged at her slippers. Where once she had spoken only to the walls, she now spoke freely to him, sharing her thoughts, her memories, her laughter. Yet the blanket remained a puzzle. Ash carried it everywhere, sleeping with it tucked under his paw. One morning, while he explored outside, Margaret lifted it and held it close. It smelled faintly of smoke and pine, of something gone but not forgotten. The thought troubled her, yet also pulled at her. Where had it come from? To whom had it belonged? One evening, Ash darted toward the forest with the blanket clenched in his teeth. Margaret followed, lantern in hand, her feet crunching over pine needles and wet earth. The pup led her deep into the woods, farther than she had walked in years, until they came to a clearing. There, half hidden by vines and moss, stood the ruins of a cabin. Its beams were blackened by fire, its roof long fallen, ashes scattered across the ground as though the forest itself had wept over it. Ash padded into the ruins, whimpering softly. Margaret stood at the edge, her chest tightening. She touched a charred post, her fingers blackened with soot, and in that moment she understood. This had been a home once. A family had lived here, laughed here, loved here. And in the chaos of fire, a pup had survived, carrying with it the only thing it could, something that had belonged to a child. Tears welled in her eyes as she knelt among the ashes. She thought of her own losses, of the empty years she had endured, and realized this was no accident. Ash had not come to her porch by chance. Fate had bound them, two souls broken by loss, carrying fragments of what once was. She reached for Ash, who pressed against her leg, blanket still clutched in his jaws. "We'll carry it together," she whispered, her voice trembling with both grief and relief. The seasons passed, and Margaret's life transformed. Ash grew tall and strong, his coat gleaming silver in the sunlight, his spirit both wild and gentle. Still, he never let go of the blanket, though it grew thinner and more worn. To Margaret, it was no longer just a remnant of tragedy, it was a symbol of survival, of connection, of love that endured even through fire and loss. Neighbors noticed the change in her. Where she had once seemed frail and withdrawn, now she moved with quiet purpose. There was light in her eyes again, a warmth in her voice when she greeted them. They spoke of the wolf pup with wonder, some in fear, but Margaret only smiled. She knew Ash was not a creature to be feared. He was her family. On summer evenings, they walked the forest paths together, her steps steady, his paws sure beside her. At night, he curled beside the fire while she read aloud, as though he understood every word. Sometimes she would wake in the dark hours to find him watching over her, golden eyes glowing faintly in the firelight, and she would feel safe in a way she hadn't for years. Margaret often thought back to that stormy night, to the moment she opened her door. If she had hesitated, if she had turned him away, she would still be sitting in silence, rocking endlessly in her chair. Instead, she had chosen compassion, and in return, she had been given new life. She knew now that the world had a strange way of healing broken hearts. Sometimes it gave us what we least expected. Sometimes the ones who need saving most are not the ones we think. Ash had carried more than a blanket to her porch that night, he had carried hope. And so the widow was no longer alone. In the heart of the mountains, in the glow of the cabin built by her husband's hands, she had found family again. She had found love in the eyes of a creature who had lost everything, just as she had. Together, they walked forward, not by forgetting the past but by carrying it, gently, faithfully, like a blanket that never let go. Sometimes, she thought as Ash chased fireflies across the meadow, the world takes everything from us only to return something greater. Sometimes, the ones we rescue are the very ones who save us.